Hey everyone, welcome back to Everything You Need to Know About Chords. In the last episode, I went over the basics of the musical alphabet, the major and minor scale, and building power chords using the perfect fifth interval. Today, we are going to work on building triads and learn to understand how that connects with the CAGED system. By the end of this episode, you're going to have the knowledge of how CAGED chords are built and the music theory behind them, and you will be able to build chord progressions using the CAGED system. And I'll also be introducing bar chords a little bit later and talk about how those play into the CAGED system as well. Everything you need to know about chords, episode 2, Triads and the CAGED system. A triad is a three-note chord typically stacked using a third interval. If we look at the major scale, we can build triads all throughout the scale, and we will end up with a mix of major and minor triads because of the unevenness in the whole and half steps, which we talked about in last week's episode. So the major scale is that whole, half, whole, half pattern. The difference between the major and minor triads is based off of the relationship between the root note and the third. A major third is the interval between the first note and the third note in the major scale. It's also 4 half steps or 2 whole steps. A minor third is the interval between the first note and the third note in the minor scale, which is 3 half steps or a whole step plus 1 half step. So let's look at that on the guitar. If I go back to that E major scale that we talked about last week, let's find the third interval. So this is the major scale. And let's find the third note of our scale. And so this is our third right here, which is a G sharp. If we were to play that, we actually can't play that across the E and A string. So I'm going to go up an octave to the E on the A string. And then I'm going to go to the octave of the G sharp, which you can always find an octave on your guitar by going 2 strings down and 2 frets over. So now we have a major third right here. And then the minor third, we can use the minor scale to find that. So the minor scale looks like this. And so if we go to the third note, that G right there is going to be our minor third. So let's do the same thing that we did for the major third. Since we can't play that across the E and A string, we're going to go up to the next octave of E, which is right here on the 7th fret of the A string. And then we can find our G by finding the octave by going 2 strings down and 2 frets over from this G. And if we play those 2 notes together, now we have a minor third. So this is the major third versus the minor third. You can see there's a half step difference between the two. Let's look at how the major scale creates a mix of these major and minor chords by visualizing it on our fretboard. Let's use the key of C major, which is the only major key that has no sharps or flats, so it's pretty easy to work with. So let's look at this horizontally on the fretboard like how we did last week, but we're going to do this on the A string starting from C, which is the 3rd fret of the A string. So there's our C major scale, and now to find the relationship between the thirds, we can find that major scale on the D string as well, and then we can play the thirds across 2 strings. So this is D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and then D again. Let's find the third interval starting from C. So that brings us to the note E. So then let's find E on the D string. And there's our major third. So then if we go up to the next note, D, and then just to kind of have a little shortcut here, we can actually just go up to the next note in our major scale on the D string, which is F. And so now we have found our third interval starting from D, which creates a minor third interval. Let's continue that pattern up the A string and D string, and we can see the order of the major and minor chords in the major scale. So now we have this pattern of C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and then we B minor third right there, and back to C. Now we found the third relationship of each chord within the major scale, and that's going to be the same for every key. So it's always going to be major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, minor, major. Let's add in the final element to our triad, which is the fifth interval. In order to play this as a chord, we're going to add in another string to the mix, so let's add in the G string. So now we can build another third interval on top of our other third interval, and there we're gonna have our full triads. So it's gonna sound like this. We have C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and then if you remember from last week, our seventh chord creates a tritone interval with the fifth. It's not a perfect fifth like all of the other chords. So if we have a minor third plus the flat five, or the tritone interval, that's going to create a chord quality known as diminished. And then we're back to C major right here. Another thing you'll notice as we map out the fifth with each of our triads, we can see that in the major triads, the relationship between the 3 and the 5 is actually a minor third interval. So a major triad is a major third plus a minor third stacked on top of each other. And then if we look at the minor triad, we have a minor third, right? And then the relationship between the 3 and the 5 in a minor triad is a major third. So it's going to be the opposite. Except for the seventh chord, right, which I talked about is that diminished chord, which is actually going to be a minor third and another minor third stacked on top of it. So that's kind of another reason why it's so dissonant. Like I said before, this is going to be the same for any major key. So now we can use the Roman numerals that I introduced last week and include chord symbols to represent major and minor. So a major triad is going to be indicated with a capitalized Roman numeral, and then the minor triad will be indicated with a dash symbol. In classical music, this will often be notated with just using a lowercase Roman numeral, so you'll see that quite often as well. But for now, I'm just going to use all the Roman numerals capitalized and use the different symbols to indicate the quality. And then with the diminished symbol, we have the little circle, almost like a degree sign for diminished. Here are the Roman numerals for the major scale that can be applied to any major key. Let's apply this to the minor scale as well, which if you remember from last week is the same, but we're starting on the 6th degree of the major scale. So that means the relative minor to C major is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is A. So if we took the same order but starting on A, we have A minor, B diminished, and let's go back down to our C here, C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, and then back to A minor. In the Roman numerals, it's going to look like this, and I'm going to be using the flat symbol for the 3, 6, and 7 chords to indicate that we're using the minor scale. Using this, we can easily translate it back to C to see how the major and minor scale triads differ. We have C minor, D diminished, E flat major, F minor, E minor, A flat major, B flat major, and then back to C minor. So now that we have a basic understanding of how triads are built within the major and minor scales, let's connect this back to the CAGED system. The CAGED system is a method used to help visualize chords all throughout the fretboard. It comes from 5 basic open chord shapes: C, A, G, E, and D. Although all of these open chord shapes look very different, they are actually all very similar when we're looking at the chord tones in the intervals within the chord shapes, because they are all just major different triads. So let me show you what I mean by that. The E, A, and D shapes are all actually the same chord voicing, just starting on different strings. So let's look at that. So if we took the open E major chord, it's built from the root on the E string, the fifth on the A string, the octave of the root on the D string. There we have our major third on the G string, another fifth on the B string, just the open B string, and then the root again on the high E string. So you can see it's really only using those 1, 3, and 5 notes, but they're doubling the fifth in the octave to create a fuller sound. So the open A chord is very similar to this. We have the root starting on A, D string has the fifth, root again on the G string, there's our third on the B string, and then the fifth on the high E string. And so the D chord is going to be the same as that as well, except we're just missing a string. So we have the root on the D string, fifth on the G string, root again on the B string, and then there's our third on the E string. They're voiced all the same way with the root fifth, root third, but the shape is changing because of the relationship between the G and the B string, which is the only two strings that have a different interval than the rest of the strings. So all the guitar strings are tuned with a perfect fifth interval, which is 5 half steps away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's A. And if we go to the fifth fret on the A string, that's D. Fifth fret of the D string, that's G. And then once we reach the G string, it's actually a major third interval, that 4 half steps away. 1, 2, 3, 4. So the G and the B string is a major third. And then we have a perfect fourth interval again on the B and the E string. So this also means that if we wanted to make each of these chords minor rather than major, we can use the same exact process by taking the note where we're playing the third and moving it back 1 half step. So on the E major chord, we're going to find our third, which is on the G string, and in this case, if we move it back a half step, it's just going to be the open G string. And now we have an E minor chord. Same thing on the A chord. Go to that third, which is on the B string, bring it back a half step. We're gonna have to adjust the fingering a little bit. And so now we're playing the first fret of the B string. And there's an A minor chord. And then the same thing on the open D chord. That third is going to be on the high E string. Adjust the fingering a little bit so we can move it back to the first fret. And there we have a D minor chord. So now let's look at the C and G chord, which are also voiced very similarly. So the C chord is built from the root on the A string, third on the D string, fifth on the open G string, root again on the B string, and then a third again on the E string. And then the G is very similar, where we have root on the E string, third on the A string, fifth on the D string, root again on the G string. And then people play this chord in 2 different ways. So you can either keep the B string open and there we have a third again, or some people prefer to play with the third fret of the B string, which would make that note a fifth. And on the high E string, we have the root again. It is actually technically possible to play open C minor and G minor chords, although you'll rarely ever see them because of how inconvenient the fingering is, which I'll show you. It would probably, like for a C minor chord, it would look something like this. Even Even for me, it's a little bit challenging to play. And then you wouldn't want to play the open E string as well. So it's not very convenient to play. And then same thing with the G chord as well. We could technically go like, let's see. Actually, that voice link's not too bad. But in that case, you wouldn't be able to play the B string open. You would have to play that 3rd fret. Because then we would have a major and a minor 3rd in our chord, which wouldn't sound very good. So that's why those open G minor and C minor aren't really a thing as much. So understanding how the CAGED chords are voiced allows you to easily understand how to turn each of these chords into minor chords and makes it a lot easier to visualize these chords as we use them all throughout the fretboard. Let's build a chord progression using opened CAGED chords. Let's look at all of the available chords we have to use, which would be C, A minor, G, E minor, D, and D minor. There's really only a few keys that would work well with these open CAGED chords. So we could use the key of G major or E minor, we could use the key of C major or A minor, and then we can also use the key of D major, A major, and E major. But as you can see, there's going to be limited options with what we can do. So you can explore other keys using the same shapes by using a capo, which clamps onto a certain fret to make it easy to use CAGED chords in a different key. So let's create major and minor chord progressions in G major and E minor, since we have a lot of options with those keys. And we can use similar strategies to what we did in the last episode to create a chord progression. In this case, any combination of the chords G, A minor, C, D, and E minor work well for both progressions. But to establish the major or minor key, we're going to use G major for the first chord in the major chord progression, and then E minor for the first chord in the minor chord progression. Here are some great G major chord progressions that we can use. Also try some 3-chord chord progressions, which are also very common. And then let's look at some E minor chord progressions. So I think what's great about this is any combination of the CAGED chords I think works really, really well in honestly any chord progression. So you can just experiment with it and then don't even feel like you have to be tied down to a certain key. Honestly, like you can just take any combination of all these CAGED chords and just like see what happens. I think it'll always make for a great chord progression. So let's look at some popular songs that use CAGED chords. So I think a great artist who uses a ton of CAGED chords is Taylor Swift. So one of my favorite songs of hers is Our Song, which is in D major and has a chord progression that goes like this. Brown Eyed Girl by Van Morrison is another great example, and this one's in G major. And then let's look at some minor songs as well. So I think maybe a good example of this might be Riptide by Vance Joy. There's a ton of songs that use the open caged chords, and there are so many possibilities with this. I haven't even touched the surface of songs that use caged chords. These are just a few examples that I could initially think of. So even though there's limited options with caged chord progressions, you can see the possibilities are really endless with this. But if we wanted to explore more possibilities outside of just the caged chords, this is where bar chords come in. A bar chord is a guitar chord where a single finger presses down on multiple strings across a fret. Technique-wise, this is a lot more difficult than just playing the open chords, which I think is why artists will often use capos, just because it'll make it a lot easier to be able to play in different keys. Yeah, and it really took me a while before I really felt comfortable playing bar chords. With bar chords, we can play any major or minor chord by using the caged chord shapes and moving them throughout the fretboard. The easiest chord shapes to try this with are the E shape and A shape. All you have to do is find the bass note of the chord you want to play. Let's say maybe we can do an F chord. So first you find the note F on the E string, which is the first fret, and create the E chord shape by barring the first fret, using it like a capo, and then creating the E chord shape. And there we have an F major chord. Similarly, if we find the root note on the A string, we can create a bar chord using the A shape. So let's try this with the note B on the second fret of the A string. And there we have a B major chord using the A shape. So you can also create bar chords using the D, G, and C chord shapes as well, using the same process. So just by finding the root note, like maybe if we wanted to do a D shape, we can go to, let's say, like a G right here, which is on the 5th fret of the D string, and create a D shape. But, you know, honestly with this one, I'm not really barring that much with my with my index finger. I'm really just like pressing down my finger on the 5th fret of the D string and then creating the D shape on top of that. Let's find like a C chord, so maybe we can go to this D here on the 5th fret of the A string, create the C shape, and so now we have to bar our finger down on the top 3 strings on the 2nd fret of the G, B, and E string. And there we have a D chord using the C shape. We can play A major using a G shape by finding the note A, which is the 5th fret of the E string. And then in this case, we're going to be barring down the 2nd fret of the D, G, and B strings. Those chord shapes I feel like are a little bit harder to do than just using the E and A chord shapes. But in the next episode, I'm going to be talking about how we can use smaller sections of those chord shapes to create inversions and play some cooler chord voicings. But I think the first step in that is being able to visualize the full chord shape before you can break it down into something smaller. So this gives you endless ways to be able to voice chords in a chord progression. So what if I took one of those chord progressions I played for G major, like G, A minor, C, D, and instead of playing that with open chords, we can try playing that with bar chords, like so we can use the E shape on the 3rd fret for that G chord, the E minor shape on the 5th fret for the A minor chord, the A shape for the C chord on the 3rd fret of the A string, and then the C shape for the D chord on the 5th fret of the A string. So I think this is actually a great way to get comfortable using bar chords all throughout the fretboard, is just by taking like a super simple chord progression and then just like using different caged chord shapes with that. I think playing chord progressions like that is a great way to work on using caged chords all throughout the fretboard. And then we can also use a mix of open chords and bar chords, which is a very common way to play bar chords, is just by mixing them in with the open chords as well. So here are a few examples of songs that do that. Fade Into You by Mazzy Star, which is, and then we have a B minor bar chord using the A shape. All Too Well by Taylor Swift, which is in C major. It uses an F bar chord using the E shape. And then a great classic rock example would be Time by Pink Floyd, which is an F sharp minor, which is the same notes as A major. It has a chord progression that uses the F sharp minor bar chord using an E minor shape. There's a ton of possibilities with these chords. When you're starting to incorporate the bar chords into your playing, you can pretty much play any chord progression. And so with this knowledge, you can look up any chord progression online and play almost any song, I think. And so along with this, you now have a deeper understanding of how chord progressions in major and minor keys function and have the skills to create any chord progression. If you want to write your own music, you can use these strategies as well. Next time, we're going to dive deeper into the CAGED system and also look at some other chord symbols that you're going to come across in a chord progression. So if you've ever looked up a chord progression and it has all these symbols like add 9 or add 4 or maybe inversions like D over F, we're gonna go over what those mean and how you can play them and how you can visualize them. So thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and please leave any questions about this topic or anything you'd like to see me discuss in future videos. I'll be happy to reply to any comments that you guys have. Thank you so much.